Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, we'll take a look into how to import and export the components in a React application. Well, here are the important points. We can export the component using export keyword, and we can import the component using import keyword. And there are two types of exports, named export and default export. We can have multiple named exports in a single file. We can have only one default export per file. We can import named export using curly braces, and we can import default export without curly braces. So let us understand these points with an example. So let us go to our VS Code IDE over here, and in order to understand importing, exporting components, let's create a new file. So go to components folder, right click, new file. Let us give file name as my component.js. Within a myComponent.js file, let's create a functional component. So here just type function and let us give component name as first component. And then here let us have a return statement and then return the heading first component. Okay, and just save it. Next, in order to use this first component in other component, we have to export this first component, right? So here let us have export. So this export is basically called a named export. Okay, and if we export something like this, export default first component, so this is called a default export. Okay, if we use export default keyword, then this is called a default export, and the earlier one, that is this one, is called the named export. Okay, and within a single JS file we can have multiple named exports. For example, here let me create one more component. So let me copy this, paste it over here, and let us give name as second component and just change the content second component. Alright, just remember, within a single JavaScript file we can create a multiple functional components and we can export them using named export. But if you want to export the functional component as a default export, then you should have a single component in a single JavaScript file. Okay, for example, if you want to export this first component as a default export, then you should have only one component per file. Okay, and you should remove this named export and you should give a default export like this, export default and then the component name. Alright, just remember, if you want to export a component as a default export, then you should have only one default export component in a single file like this. Okay, perfect. Next, let us see how to import the named export and default export. So here let me undo it and let me first show you how to import the named export. So here we have created first component, second component, and we have exported these components as a named export. Next, let us see how to import these two components. So let us go to app.js file. Now let us see how to import the named exports. Well, if you go to myComponent.js file, so here we have exported first component, second component using named export. Next, let us see how to import these two named exports. So go to app.js, and in order to import the named export components, here we have to use import keyword and then open and close curly braces and then first component from my component file. Okay, so whenever you want to import the named export component, then you should have to use the open and close curly braces like this. Next, here let us use it. So here just type first component and close it and then show this file, and here you can see in a browser first component is displayed. Similarly, if you go to myComponent.js file, here we have a second component and we have exported this second component using named export. So let us see how to import this second component in a app.js file. So here go to import statement and within curly braces we have already imported post component. Along with that, let us also type second component, and here let us use it, second component. Perfect. And if you look at the browser, second component is printed. Alright, so this is how we import a named exported components in a app component like this. Okay, so make sure that you use open and close curly braces to import the named components. And let us say you want to give a different name to this component, then you can use alias over here. For example, al and just give fc. Okay, and if you save this file, you will get the error because you have given different name to this component, right? So here, instead of first component, we have to give fc, and then if you save this file, you can take a look at the browser, first component is displayed. And again, if you want to give alias to second component, you can just type as and then sc. Sc stands for second component, and just remove this second component name and then just type the alias second component. Okay, so this is how you can change the exported component name by using alias. So this is all about how to export and import the components using named export. Next, let us see default export. So go to mycomponent.js file. Here let's create one default export component. So here function and then component name, let us say my component, and let us have return statement, and let us print my component. Next, in order to import this component in another component, we have to export it. So far we have seen how to export the components using named export. Now we are going to see how to export the component using default export, right? So here just type export and then append default. So this is the default export. Okay, so you can prefix the component using export default like this, or you can give this default export at the end like this. Okay, so most of the developers use this kind of syntax. Okay, now we have one default export per file. Next, let us save this file and let us go to app.js file and let us see how to import the default export component. So here let us have import statement, import and then my component from my component.js file. So notice here, while importing the default exported component, we don't have to use the open and close curly braces. But in case of named exports, we are using the curly braces to import it. Next, let us use this my component in an app component. So here go at the bottom and then just type my component and then close it, and then just save this file and take a look at the browser. You can see my component is displayed over here. Next, let us say how to give a different name to this my component. Well, in case of named exports, we have used alias to give the different name to the component, right? But in case of default export, we don't have to use the alias. We can simply change the component name itself. For example, here instead of my component, let me give my C and then just save the file, and look at here, we got the error because we have given the different name to the component while importing. So here instead of my component, just give MC and then save the file, and look at here, my component is displayed in the browser. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there should be only one default export component per file. That's why while importing the default export component, we can give any name that we want, because we showed that the file contains only one default export, isn't it? So this is all about the default export. When we create a full stack application using Spring Boot and React, we are going to use these named export and default export a lot. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture.